All right, so today we're talking camera animation, and most of the stuff I'm going to tell you in this video will be applicable regardless of what software you're using, because I have most of my camera experience not from animating it in CG shots, but from doing actual videography in the real world with a physical camera. But there's a lot of things that I have noticed that usually aren't done very well when it comes to animating a camera, things I've done that I think I can help maybe steer people away from. So we're gonna start off with the basics, just a few camera staging and cinematography rules that are just good to know if you don't already know them. We're gonna work our way up into some camera settings you need to know about, some animation tips for actually getting in and animating the camera, regardless of what software you're using. And then we'll end on some more advanced workflows and other tools that will be useful for you to know that will make your life easier dealing with cameras. Sound good? Cool. In case you're new here, hi, I'm Sir Wade, and we do a ton of animation stuff here on the channel, so subscribe if you haven't already, like this video if you find it helpful, and links below to Twitch if you want to talk about this kind of stuff live, to my Patreon if you want to support the channel, and so on. Let's jump in, let's do some camera stuff. We have a lot to talk about, so into Maya. And those of you who are here for my Blender videos, have no fear, you can use all the same stuff that I'm about to show in this video. Most of my Maya videos are like that. They're useful tips regardless of the software, but I am best and most comfortable in Maya. So, I'm gonna be using Maya today. All right, so say you've got a scene with two characters. We've got Aya with two different variations, and this is an acting scene. So these characters are gonna talk. Let's talk about the different shot types. We'll start at the basics. If our camera were out super far, we'd probably call this an establishing shot. I don't have a set here, which I probably should to get the full effect, but an establishing shot just shows you the big picture. Super zoomed out, you can see what other props and what the environment looks like, so you really establish the scene, the setting, all that kind of stuff. Pretty straightforward. Now focusing on the character with the blue shirt, this is what we would consider a wide shot. You can see the whole character. Then I can go to a medium shot, usually about the torso, maybe a little bit further. A close-up, which is, maybe from the chest to the head. Then you've got the extreme close-up, which is just the face, and a super extreme close-up is just the eyes. These will shift a little bit depending on where you hear the information. This is what I was told, but these are the general kind of jumps that you would make with your camera. But a few things to avoid. In the medium shot, you shouldn't have the character's head grazing the top of frame. Most likely, there are rules that can be broken in all cases here, but you usually don't want to have your character cut off at some kind of a joint, the knees, the hips, the very top of the head, things like that. So find kind of a center point where that's not an issue. Also, it should be noted in the software, this is not a good accurate representation of the camera. You actually need to turn on the camera preview to see the border of the actual render. So you may need to adjust, but for this video, we're just gonna go with the viewport as our camera. Now, the distance from the character starts to become really important as you look at the settings for those cameras. For example, here we have a wide shot with both characters, and it's a very static, flat shot. We're not talking about the interest necessarily here, but we've got both characters in full view, and that's fine. This is a wide shot, but if we go in mid, you'll notice that the characters at this point, they're actually starting to distort. If you look at the shape of their faces, they're starting to kind of widen, which is weird. So the camera is actually distorting them in an interesting way versus this camera view where they're just completely side profile. Now the camera is actually at the same general angle. It's just to the very side of them, exactly at the side, pointing straight towards them. There's no difference aside from the focal length, which we'll talk about in a second, but you do want to keep in mind whether or not your character is being distorted. But I just wanted to show you in practice that this can really affect your shot for a lot of different reasons. Now, this wouldn't be a camera video if we didn't briefly mention the 180 rule. If you haven't heard of this rule before, this is a filmmaking technique / rule that you should follow. There's always exceptions, there's always reasons to break things, but in most cases, you're gonna wanna listen to this one. Now, the 180 rule is essentially when you have two characters that are interacting in some way, and if you were to draw a line through both of them, your camera can exist anywhere on this 180 degrees of the circle. Your camera cannot cross this line. The reason for that is because it would be jarring to the audience. Let me show you what this means. And if you're familiar with this rule, bear with me. We're gonna get to the advanced stuff in a minute. Now, this rule is usually referring to when you are dealing with multiple shots stuck together, you're editing them together. That's called a sequence. A sequence is composed of many different shots. Every time the camera cuts, that's a new shot. And that looks like this. Orange shirt on the left, blue shirt on the right, and you just keep it that way. No matter where this camera goes, no matter what it does, you just don't flip it. So you can cut from here, you can cut from here. We can do an over-the-shoulder shot where we are watching one talk to the other. You can flip and cut to the other camera, and you can go back and forth all you want because orange is left and blue is right. You can do a wide shot, you can cut back in, you can jump from over the shoulder to the other over the shoulder, you can do a medium shot, you can cut back in, you can have a super, super wide shot for some reason. What you're trying to avoid is having this orange on the left suddenly flip to the right. That's what throws the audience off, and you don't want to do that. So just rule of thumb, follow the 180 rule. There you go. And there are camera positioning rules with power dynamics. If you have your camera having a character look down at another, it makes the character in blue here feel a lot more powerful than the one in orange. She's talking down to her, even though we know they're at the same height. But the camera angle is implying that one character has more power versus this up angle. This is, in this case, it's actually kind of showing us the same thing reversed. We're seeing the orange character having more power, the blue character looking like she's looking up. So it's the same power dynamic, but from two different angles. And if we're just looking at one character, looking down on this character, same thing, it makes this character feel more powerless. Looking up at her, you get a much more heroic, looking off into the distance, gonna go fight a monster type of deal. So this kind of dips into the psychology of how the camera will make the audience feel. Also very important, but trying to go fast so I can show you how to animate the cameras. So I hope this was a good refresher. Now let's dive into the settings part and how to actually animate these cameras once you have them in place. Now, something super important that you should consider when you are animating a camera, or even if your camera is gonna stay static, anytime you're setting up a shot in CG, this is something that gets overlooked all the time, because having a camera that you can just hit create camera, we can really take for granted the default settings, but it's an important part to look at the focal length. That's like the number one setting that I would recommend you take a look at. It can make a big difference in your shot. So in Maya, selecting the camera icon and coming over to the right, Control A to switch us over the attribute editor. You can do the same thing in Blender by hitting, what is it, the N key, and then it pulls up that menu. Is that right? I think it's the N key, I don't know. You wanna look for the focal length. Now, focal length becomes very important for, I guess, 2 or 3 main reasons. Number one is the actual appearance of your character, their face, their body proportions, any distortion that might happen. The background is number 2, and number 3 is kind of like the energy of the way your shot feels for the audience. This one's a lot easier to show you than to tell you, so let's just do that. This is what happens if I look at the character through a 50mm lens. I believe this is Maya's default, it might be Blender's default, not really sure. This is what we would consider a portrait photography type of lens. And what happens is if we make the focal length smaller, the number becomes smaller, the angle becomes wider. So we see more of the background, but it also distorts the character in an interesting way. So if I go from 50mm down to 24mm, you can see we see more of the background, but her face starts to get more fisheyed. If I go all the way down to 14mm, she gets really distorted and we can see more of that cube. So comparing that to a 24, see how we only have the top of this cube, and then the 14, we can see the whole cube. But the other objects are being pushed further back behind her, obscured by her distorted face. So you can kind of see the difference as I jump between 14, 24, and 50. So it changes the way we see the character, but it also changes the background. If I go up to an 85mm, her face gets flatter, more round. As it compresses the distance, you can also see that cone looks a lot closer to the camera. If I jump to a 200mm lens, it looks like she's like inside of this torus, that cone is right next to her. When we look at the longer lens or the bigger number of focal length, look at the position of the torus, this ring behind her. As we get to the bigger numbers, it looks like it's coming closer and closer towards the camera, right? What's happening is a longer focal length is taking all that long distance, that telescopic distance, and it's compressing it, making it all feel like it's very close to us, which is why her face, back to front, is kind of flattening out and we're getting a more rounded shape versus this, which is opening up and we're seeing a lot of the sides and it's kind of curving. It's a whole thing. This is obviously making a big difference to our character, so you're gonna want to adjust the focal length to suit whatever it is you're doing. Now, a few just rule of thumbs for you. If you are animating some kind of high energy action, parkour, something like that, and you want it to be really dynamic, if you have a character moving their arms back and forth like this, the distance from the camera and away is gonna get a lot more aggressive in a smaller focal length, a wider angle of view. So if you have a, say, 24mm or a 14mm, you may not want it, but what happens is anything that gets closer to the camera becomes very, very large compared to anything that's really far away. If we just move the camera physically in and out, you will see this effect become more or less as you get closer or further from the camera. So if you're very far away with a wide lens, you may not notice it, but as things get closer to the lens, they distort more. You can kind of see the effect here. Versus here at 85, as I move the camera and I get really close to the character, it's not distorting her face really at all. You'll usually see more comedy shots set to something less than 50, more dramatic, like background blurry, TV drama type things. Those happen in like 70, 85mm, more. Longer focal lengths will give you that blurry background, really intense, focused, zoomed in on the character. That's usually how those are filmed. That blurry background is something you can turn on in the 3D software. Maya, it's pretty slow. Blender, it's actually really fast. So depending on your tool, you can do it. Often it's just recommended to not worry about that while you animate, do it in post, do it as a compositing effect, and it's just much simpler that way. We can talk about it in another video. For now, we gotta talk about animating these cameras finally, after all of this time. So let's animate something. Now, camera animation is not the easiest thing to just do. It's one of the fastest ways to get your shot completely unwatchable. If you are trying to do a demo reel, I recommend just not doing any camera animation unless you know what you're doing. Because if you make the camera really aggressive, really jerky, really fast, doing a lot of cuts, it will completely disorient your audience or make the motion sick, and nobody wants that. So a few tips as you animate your cameras to hopefully not have that happen. So if you set a key on the first frame of your shot and then you go to the last frame where you want your camera to be, if you do just a simple, maybe a zoom and a pan, keep it very simple, translation, but no rotation. That will give you a subtle little zoom. So this is just a dolly and a pan, nothing crazy. Keeping it limited to just translation or just rotation will make it a lot easier to control your shot and not to make people just upset watching it. Having a lot of keyframes for whatever reason is one of the fastest way to get jerky animation. So keep the keyframes to a minimum and also know how to adjust the splines in the graph editor. If you need any help with that, I have a video on the graph editor, helps immensely. I highly recommend checking that out. But jerky animation's bad. Obviously the background elements are moving a lot, both characters are swinging around, there's a lot happening, and we haven't really done all that much. So it's very easy to get out of hand quickly with your camera stuff. So a few additional tips are obviously keep the minimal amount of keyframes that you can. Keep your splines as smooth as possible. If we're looking at these curves are not smooth. And usually with animation, you're not just trying to make all your splines look super pretty, because you may need to keep some organic motion that maybe has some jagged edges and things like that. Cameras usually don't apply in that way. Unless you're going for a very specific look and you know how to get that and you did it on purpose, cool. But for most of us, you don't want all these little jumpy parts. And not that you necessarily just want to start deleting keys like I'm doing now, because even by doing that, we can still have jerky animation. We still have a lot of stuff going on. So that's why you need to understand what's actually happening in the graph editor, but just know that you want it to be as smooth as possible. One of the biggest things to remember is that these cameras aren't just these little floating things in your 3D software. They represent real equipment. They may represent a small little phone. They may be a giant cinema camera on a dolly in this big mechanized, motorized thing. Regardless, it represents something that's heavy or at least has some amount of weight. So you don't want your camera just zooming through the scene, whipping around as if it weighs nothing, because in the software, it doesn't, obviously. But you need to really think about not just how is the camera moving, but imagine there's somebody holding that camera. If it's heavy and they need to whip it to the side, they've got to build up momentum and then push it and then slow it down. That all needs to feel real and grounded. Otherwise, your shot's just gonna feel really CG. Your camera's gonna feel very computer generated and fake. Here's another big one usually not to do. It's fine to rotate the camera up and down. It's fine to move it left and right when you're rotating. Don't go side to side. Try not to roll the camera like this. That is how you trigger motion sickness. It can give you Dutch angles. It can give you like being on a boat and different things. There are reasons why it can be useful, but it destabilizes the ground. It gets you off balance, which may be an effect you're going for, but only if you really know what you're doing. That is one of the fastest way to make people seasick or just motion sick. And that's why VR doesn't work for a lot of people, because you get that sensation and it puts things off balance, and don't do it. If this rule doesn't apply to you, you probably already know that. So if you're watching this video and absorbing these things as lessons, just take that one as one to follow for now. Don't roll the camera. Your viewers will thank you. And because of that, you probably don't want to just move your camera around like this, because it may move on all three axes. You want to be a lot more intentional about which of the three axes you are messing with at a time. So Blender users, don't just hit the R key and start spinning. You're gonna get that. All right, now for some advanced workflows. Here's our camera. Here is the actual, what that camera looks like. So to move it around, kind of see it there. A few quick things. One thing you can do is, let's say you're animating a roller coaster, a character flying, a dragon, something like that, and your stuff needs to move through space. You may not want to animate the camera trying to keyframe it alongside your character, so it would be easier to parent or constrain that camera to your object, whatever's moving. There's a few ways you can do that. The easiest way, and probably not something you want to do in this way, but you could just easily grab the camera and parent it to whatever. So in this case, I've just created a face cam. As the head moves, the camera follows it. That could be helpful if for some reason you need the camera to follow a character's face, then no matter what they do, that's gonna stick there. This is not something I'd recommend as a way to animate your character's face for the entirety of your shot. I've tried this before as a student when I was like, my character's head is moving all over the place. I'm just gonna have the camera locked on and I'll animate the whole face that way. This doesn't show you what the face would look like from the actual render camera point of view, like where your real camera is gonna be. So I wouldn't recommend that. Maybe to get some lip sync stuff, just to get, general, not having to chase your character around and see how it looks. But ultimately, it's not the full solution. Now, if you're just trying to animate a simple turntable, your asset that you created and a camera just moving around it, there is a really easy way to do it. It's in the animation menu set under Visualize, there's a Create Turntable button, where if you go into there, you can kind of decide how this works, how long is the turntable, and which direction does it go. That will automatically create a camera, spin your asset, and render it out. But that's usually not what we want, especially for just a regular shot. Now, rather than trying to actually take this camera and manipulate it in a circle and rotate it and deal with the keyframes, no one wants to do that. So an easier way is this. If you create a locator, or in Blender, I guess it's called an empty, if you create some kind of an object like so, and then parent your camera to that, all you need to do is animate that locator 360 degrees around that vertical axis, and you will have a perfect 3D 360 spin. And it's not limited to just doing a 360 spin. You could just have it as an easy way to move your camera from a specific point. Because with a little bit of tweaking, we can make this feel more like the character is going from a cutscene to maybe some kind of third-person video game animation. Now, another good trick, this is when you do need the camera to move through a scene. You may, again, not want to just keyframe the camera and try to smooth out the curves. So something you can do is there's a whole bunch of curve tools inside of Maya or Blender or whatever tool. You can draw them manually if you have a Cintiq or a stylus of any kind, some kind of a graphic display tablet. I have a few recommendations linked below if you're in the market for one. I'll also be reviewing this one over here shortly, so video coming up on that. Either way, if you create a curve in your software, you can attach a camera to that path. So if I take the camera, take the curve, and I would go up to the animation tool set, go to Constrain Motion Path, Attach to Motion Path, hit this option box, you can control, maybe you want to change how long this takes. You want to probably set the front axis, so in this case, the Z is the front, Y is up, that's backwards from Blender. You can play with these settings. One thing that you can turn on is bank. That is if you want to do maybe like a first person camera, and as it's turning, it's kind of banking side to side. You can have that automatically happen from the curve. I'm not going to worry about that. We'll deal with that another time. And if you're wondering like, what are all these settings? How do you mess with this? I want more information. Come hang out on Twitch. Ask me these questions live. I do a bunch of this kind of demo stuff live on Twitch. So we'll just hit attach for now. So if I make a whole bunch of cubes, just so we have kind of a world to exist within, and we go ahead and hit play, you can see that that camera is going very fast, but it's zipping around that control path, and we can easily make adjustments to where this path will go by messing with the actual curve itself. And you can use all your soft selection tools and regular modeling tools that you'd expect, and you'll see it moves the camera along that path. So if you need to create a roller coaster for your camera to do its thing, you can use tools like this to get the camera animation more dialed in and much more visual than trying to use the actual motion path tool inside a software like Maya, because the motion path tools, bleh. This is a little bit easier to mess with in my opinion. But if you are gonna do this, probably don't draw the curve. You can see how many just dots there are. That's a lot to mess with. If you use something like the Bezier tool, you can get different shapes with much fewer control points. So just a few curves and their handles. It's a lot easier to tweak it and make those changes than something with a million control vertices. Now there's one more camera tool that I need to talk about, and that's called the camera sequencer inside of Maya. I don't have time to talk about it. It's gonna take me far too long. This video is long enough already. So if you wanna know more about the camera sequencer, come hang out on Twitch. I may do another video in the future where I tackle this, but just to give you a brief idea of how this works, what you do is you create different cameras. You put them where you want them in your scene. It's best if you do that first, makes it easier. And then what you'll do is you'll create a shot. You'll go to the option and you'll give that shot a name. Keep it sequential, be more specific, it's up to you. And then you pick the camera that you want this shot to correspond to. So if you already have all your cameras in place, looking at the right spot, right angles, then you just pick the one from the list. You give it a frame start time. So if it's, frame 40 through 350 or something, and that's the time that you want that camera active, you tell it so. And it'll ask you where you want it. This is for kind of editing reasons. So you just say after current shot. That's probably the best way to do it. You can also set an image. In this case, I have an image set from when I was using this on stream. That's if you've storyboarded your sequence and you want your cameras to match that. It becomes an image plane overlay, and it becomes very easy to move your camera around and overlay your geometry so that things line up. But regardless, you don't need to have that. But ultimately what you'll end up with is you'll have a bunch of different shots, which I can kind of just show you the idea, is you can have a bunch of different shots and you can layer them together, and you can create a sequence where your cameras are switching between the active cameras, and you put together and you edit within Maya your overall animation. The thing is, you can also do cool stuff where you maybe have each camera kind of jump back in time. So it doesn't have to play from 1 to 1,000 in order. You can have it play from 1 to 100 and then from like 80 to 200. So it kind of plays and then goes back in time on the next camera, if that makes sense. So you can do all your editing inside of Maya. And when you go to export, you can play blast a selected shots, all the shots, a certain sequence. You can get really complicated. You can drop in audio. Personally, I've never done all that. I just mix all my stuff outside of Maya. But you have the ability to create a whole camera sequence with what camera comes first and where does it go and so on. As a thing that you should know about, the camera sequencer exists, and that is the proper way to have multiple cameras within one sequence. If you have one camera just keyframed, jumping around and teleporting around your scene to get the different angles, if you render with motion blur, it's gonna totally break it. But if you're just play blasting, it's fine, won't matter. That'll work just well enough for you. And as a thanks for sticking around this long, here's one more tip that should be very helpful. Less is usually more when it comes to camera cuts. You don't need to have 5 different camera angles, jumping back and forth for an entertaining shot. It's usually better to just leave the camera mostly stationary and not cut to another angle. Let the audience really see what's happening, be zoomed out enough that you can see what's going on. When it comes to live action, they have to cut to cheat things, to hide things. 2 actors probably don't want to punch each other in the face, so you need to trick it with angles and maybe editing to make it look like they hit each other and put a sound effect. In animation, you can do whatever you want. You can have a character punch straight through the other person's head. It's probably a little aggressive, but you can do whatever you need. So you don't have to do all the same cheats that live action directors need to mess with. So show the action. Let your audience really appreciate all your work. And if you enjoyed this video, if you learned something, please hit this button so more people on YouTube see it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Links below to Twitch if you want to talk about this stuff live or ask any questions. Also, there's a link to the Discord down below, which has 4,000 or 5,000 people in it, different artists, all hanging out, learning from each other, a great community to be a part of. But hopefully this video gives you an idea of some of the things you can do with your cameras, some different ideas to make working and animating with cameras easier, and just overall making your shots a more enjoyable experience for the people watching. So thanks again for watching this whole video all the way to the end. I do appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video.